And we have extra time for questions. So here's the plan. I can imagine that you have questions from one or more. Try to keep the question as focused as you can. I imagine we'll have lots of questions, and we've got the time to pull it off. And then I think the last 10 minutes, Michael's job is to have listened to the presentations, the questions, answers, discussion, and then sort of wrap up with some comments that bring us back to vision and strategy. That's our concept here. We're trying to end each segment, raising it back to the level of the national strategy, the framework, the key elements, etc. So here's a question. Maybe Maureen, over here.
Hi, Dean Tepper from the Office of the Worker Councillor in Nova Scotia.
Okay, great.
My question is directed toward Catherine and the WCB system. I noticed in your slides, you know, we all call it a no-fault system. I don't feel it's that way any longer. We as workers still don't have the right to sue our employers when we get hurt, but yet the employers, at least in my province, still have the right to appeal every single decision that WCB makes on a claim. So we can't sue, but the employer can appeal what drug we're getting. They can appeal our wage loss. They can appeal everything, leading to years of delays for a worker to get what he's entitled to, he or she to get what she's entitled to. The other part I want to talk about that is we hear a lot about totally employer funded, which I don't feel is the case anymore either. We have a waiting period in Nova Scotia of 3 days. We get for TURB, we get 75% of our net income. On an EURB, we get 85% of our net income. If it was a totally employer-funded system, it would be 100% of our gross. How come we're suffering with 75% of our net when we're injured and not 100% of our gross? And as far as the incentives for employers on the experience rating, I feel from what I know of the system and what I deal in the system, that it's more of an incentive to promote claim suppression. We have thousands and thousands of workers across this province, across this country, sitting in offices doing absolutely nothing because it's cheaper for their employer to have them there sitting doing nothing than it is to finding meaningful work. Some of these workers should be home, getting healing from their injury, and not sitting in an office doing nothing. So my thoughts is, how do we get back to the Meredith principles, where it's a no-fault system? How do we get rid of the experience rating so workers, and get back to a fully funded system so injured workers can have a little dignity and have the time they need to heal so they can return to their full employment? Thank you.
So let's address that to Catherine.
Thank you for that question. In 1999, I published an article called Blaming the Victim in a No-Fault System, so I hear you. You didn't mention the private detectives that are used to follow workers around. There are lots of abusive practices that have grown up over the decades, because since the first decade of the 20th century, we have workers' compensation systems. In my province, I'm from Quebec, at one point politicians said we have to make employers responsible. Il faut qu'ils mettent leur culotte was the statement. And they introduced experience rating, very highly experience rated premiums, with the idea, what they said was that this would help for the prevention of injury. But if you want to know what it does, look at who gets hired after you introduce an innovation like that. So there's now a flourishing law business in workers' compensation. I wrote a thesis on workers' compensation in 1980, and I was the second after 1953. Nobody in law was paying attention to workers' compensation. So we have incentives that are well-meaning initially, or at least, I mean, I can't say what the meaning is of politicians, but the idea was that employers just wrote this off as an expense of doing business, didn't try to bring people back to work. The only place I disagree with you in terms of what you said is that Meredith didn't talk about return to work. And the injured workers I talked to today want to go back to work, but they don't want to go back to work doing meaningless work. So that what I think is that we now, the economic incentives have become the end rather than the means to an end. And we have to get back to the means to the end, that the idea of the economic incentives is to promote sustainable return to work for people. And if that means being off for 6 months because you're going to be better if you come back after 6 months, that's what it has to be. And you shouldn't be charging employers 5 times the cost of the actual benefits to force them to bring them back on day 3. So we have to really revisit those, because the perverse effects that you're talking about, I've heard about these in many, many provinces.
So thank you, Catherine. I think what I might do here on this one is see whether others have any comments more broadly on the fact that so many programs have incentives and disincentives that take us in the wrong direction. If anyone has comments on that, because it's not just a matter that comes up in workers' compensation. Anyone have comments on that? Oh, Michael?
Just briefly, Catherine mentioned and so did Emile, the importance of social assistance in the country, and John Stapleton's important work on the welfarization of disability. It's the single largest source of income for low-income Canadians with disabilities. And in most provinces, the incentives are still, well, they don't really, we talk about work transition, pro-work, making it more employment ready, but with earnings exemptions of $50 a month or $75 a month with clawbacks. In BC, we've just raised our earnings exemption to $12,000 a year for someone on disability. So you can get a maximum benefit now of about $16,000 a year. You could work and top up another $12,000. Now, that's less than 1% of the caseload of 110,000 people that would relate to. So in addition to work earnings exemptions, we need to invest on the upstream in the supports and services and inclusive workplaces and so forth. There's only so much we can do with social assistance, and we expect too much of it, actually. But we need to take out the abusive and the negative stigma and the disincentives. We need to put more of an employment support philosophy in that program. And we've got to figure out what Sherry Torsman calls the welfare wall. Others called it the poverty trap a long time ago, which is the ratchet effect of losing all sorts of benefits when you migrate off social assistance. And again, some provinces are thinking about that more systematically than others. We need that to be part of a national conversation as well.
So any other questions?
Hello, my name is Gary Malkowski from the Canadian Hearing Society. The trend I'm seeing is that there's outsourcing of work, downsizing. Larger companies, including all levels of government, are downsizing, and it's impacting small businesses. Technology is replacing human capital, and funding is downloaded from the federal to provincial, and then to municipal, and then on to nonprofit organizations. And so there's pressure on us. And Canada declared a shortage of work in the labor force, of skilled labor forces. And more employers are creatively discriminating. And how do we close that loophole and accountability? Right now, we face the stats right now for deaf and hard of hearing people being unemployed or underemployed has doubled. And individuals are not going to university or post-secondary education. Skilled trades aren't providing accessibility in their programs. Slowly, it's becoming limited for deaf and hard of hearing people. The only program that was really successful was the VRS program, the Vocational Rehab Services program, which enabled individuals to get employment and co-op work. Legislation is going to be great, it'll be good, but that's not going to change people's attitude or people's behaviors. Just like the tobacco prohibition, you know, now that's changing behavior, right? And now everyone can't smoke in restaurants or hotels, and so that in turn is changing the attitude. And so we need to find a way collectively address this. It's a serious problem, and we need the government's attention. How are you going to report that? And how should we proceed? The one thing you should be looking at is civil inclusion in terms of children, their rights to be involved and be political activists. It currently in this environment promotes culture of fear. The culture now doesn't allow individuals to speak out. There are lots of disabled people who are too afraid to speak out, and they don't want to lose their current employment, and that harms their chance for promotion. It's a huge issue. How do you plan to get that legislation to enable real action in Canada?
All right. I think it's several questions in there, and I'll try to unpack them a little bit and address them to the right people on the panel. First was a question about the changing economy, technology, which obviously can be a tremendous threat, especially when mentioning the kind of discrimination that can occur. The second question was the, I guess we'll call it how to change behavior. So that's really about culture change, attitudinal change, but behavior fundamentally. And third, how to deal with, I guess, what you called the culture of fear, people afraid to speak up. So I think what we'll do is we'll start with the first and move on. So let's look, perhaps it could be Michael to start with. And I think Catherine mentioned the precarious work. Maybe Stevens, probably everybody has something to say about the economy. It's easy to say that a changing economy and technology, I guess we'll say, bring a promise of positive change, and there are, also many threats. So let's try to unpack that a little bit. Start with maybe Catherine, and then Stephen. You have something to say too? Let's go down the panel on this because it's a complex issue that I think people have a contribution on. Changing economy and technology.
There are lots of questions there, and I think for simplicity's sake, I'd like to talk about the idea of cultural change and so on. So I think, I started off talking about the convention and what the purpose of the convention is. And I mean, it's a long-term project. The changing of understanding of the role of people with disabilities in society. I mean, I've been involved with work on the CRPD for 15 years, and we're really just beginning it in a lot of ways. When I talk about cultural change and the role of the UN Convention in that process, I often like to draw an analogy to other UN conventions, like the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. If you think about the CEDAW Convention and where women are in society now and where they were 25 years ago. Is that better? People can't hear me. Welcome to my world. In any case, I was just making the analogy between the Disability Convention and the Women's Convention. Think about where women are in society now and where they were 25 years ago, the role that they have and the place that they have has changed, and it's not changed entirely because of the Women's Convention, but the Women's Convention has been involved in that process. And I see the Disability Convention as part of that in a similar way. We're talking about the role and situation of people with disabilities to be treated in an equal fashion with others. And I think that even to begin to have those kinds of discussions is a change in thinking for a lot of people. So we're still, after 15 years of work on the convention, in many ways at the beginning of the process. We're to talk to people who've been involved with other UN conventions that have been around and reporting for 20 and 30 years, and they've been through 4 or 5 cyclical reviews and so on. And they look at where they were in the first cyclical review and where they are now, and there's some very significant changes. So I think that the UN Convention for people with disabilities has the potential to play a similar role.
Okay, let's look at, maybe people should just address the different facets of the question that I think that might be better.
Okay, is
I was
that on?
trying to
Okay.
sort of separate them out, but going 1, 2, 3, I don't think will work too well.
Yeah, might be challenge. There's lots of layers to that question. I was just going to speak to the notion of precarious employment more broadly and how it touches on different people's social locations. We've seen this across the board in most developed countries, that incomes are getting much more polarized. You know, there's higher returns to people with high education, and the people who with low human capital, low levels of education, are doing much worse over time in most recent time periods, so much more polarization. We saw the opportunities also in some of the data from Turcotte that I was showing too, where the people with less in high school, much more challenged in trying to find paid employment compared to people with post-secondary educations. There was less of a disparity between able-bodied and disabled people there. So again, you see that different outcomes for people with higher education versus lower education. Now, precarious employment is something that touches on, I guess, across the labor market, not just people with disabilities. A lot of effort by employers to avoid, I guess, payroll costs, ongoing obligations to pay people over the life course of employment within an organization. So they hire them when they need them, they lay them off when they don't. That's a real challenge in general for the labor market to deal with and society to deal with, of how we can think about more portability of at least some of the benefits that we receive from employers that are very employer dependent now. I think some of our visionary panel tomorrow will speak a little bit about that, about the need to have more portability of some of the things that are currently tied to employer-based kind of benefits programs, that at least if you don't have a job for life, that you can take with you the benefits over your career trajectory across different employers. But it is something particularly for people with disabilities, a challenge to deal with, I guess, in the precarious employment. People often will have multiple concurrent jobs, so just navigating between jobs that concurrently or over time, you know, that transitions between jobs is a real challenge for people, and particularly with people with disabilities. And so we need to think about how can we facilitate inclusive labor markets, given the nature of labor market contracting in the current world of work, which is very different from what we used to see historically, where people had jobs and internal labor markets, their career trajectories were within an organization over their life course.
Just quickly. The culture of fear is an important issue. And I would, on workers, people with disabilities who are workers, but all workers live in a culture of fear at different degrees for different reasons. And I think that is in part because there is such a huge disparity between the working conditions of the precariously employed and the working conditions of people with a stable job. It's the same way that you don't want to get cut off welfare because then you end up homeless. You don't want to lose your good job even though you would need accommodations to be a better worker and to be more productive, because you might end up outside and then you'll end up working for a temp agency, and then the next thing you know, you're going to end up with no income. So I think we have to adjust the culture of fear. But we also have to address the culture of distrust in management and the way we train our managers. Technology can be used for wonderful things and terrible things. It can be used to put a GPS in a worker's truck so you know where he is all the time. So if he says he hasn't gone to the bathroom, you can know that he's parked to go to the bathroom. It can also be used to allow somebody with a disability to work from home with telework. If you trust the person, that they will be as productive as they can be without having a supervisor. And there are many studies that have come out showing people are much more productive using telework than if you bring them in 2 hours traffic. If you're in Toronto, by the time they get to work, they're worn out. So these are issues, there are many cultural problems, but trust and fear are two big issues that I think we're going to have to collectively address, and you can't legislate on that. You have to really think about it culturally. How am I doing my work, and how have I gotten used to the idea that I can't trust my secretary if I'm not in the office to see what she's doing?
Okay, any comment from Michael? That's very useful.
Yeah, and I think part of trying to have that trust, as the employer panel talked about, the need for sharing stories, the need for conversations, that this is a dialogue, the comment that accommodation or inclusion is not a destination, it's an ongoing process. And I think also that every worker, including managers, are accommodated in one way or another. There's all sorts of accommodations, but they're not called accommodations. There's this huge unofficial world of accommodations, of people going off early, leaving work to take care of family or other responsible doctor's appointments. So the time that's not documented, that's not, but if we start to think about everybody gets accommodated one way or the other, or gets benefit of the doubt at times, depending on who you are, where you work, and your status, and it's harder for others to ask for accommodation or to disclose. We haven't talked too much about that yet, the dangers of even disclosing the form. It might be part of an orientation package, but it's not just because it's a long form. Canadians are fearful, particularly around mental health, to disclose that they've got a mental health condition. They see it as a job killer. So again, the mix of incentives and disincentives is very profound there.
Okay, we have time for at least a couple more questions before we wrap up around 10 to 12.
Hi, my name's John Van Dam. I work for the Ontario government and Ministry of Advanced Education and Skills Development. And we recently released a provincial employment strategy for people with disabilities that Jamie from Dolphin Digital actually helped us develop. She's on a working group. And one of the things we heard when we were developing the strategy was people with disabilities, they really want to focus on their abilities rather than their disabilities. And I think this echoes what Gary was saying from Canadian Hearing Society as well. There's a need for a culture change. And so I have a bit of concern with regard to quota systems, because I'm concerned that quota systems can give you the wrong message that people with disabilities, they need additional, they're not as the same level or competency as other people who are being employed, that they're being employed because they have to be employed. I think that, so I'm a bit concerned with that whole system recommendation or approach. It's also with the use of deep wage subsidies that the federal government often is promoting. So I'm wondering about just your response to that. And also I want to agree with Michael Prince that there's a much more need for alignment between the federal and provincial programs. Sometimes you have providers in the same community competing against each other, and employers are often inundated with different service providers competing to place the same person. And finally, I think one thing that may be missing is maybe what we have in our strategy is the government as a leader. I think there's a need for provincial and federal governments to make a more active role in promoting and being able to hire people with disabilities within the civil service.
Very good. So let's, again, perhaps have people respond to the parts of it that affect them. Start with Catherine in terms of especially the
quota system, yeah.
Sort of quota system and the issues. I think it's called grant levy in parts of Europe.
Yeah, I understand the reservations with that, and because I've heard about the system for a while. I haven't studied the system. But the question that I would put to everybody is that we have no incentive to not discriminate against people with disabilities. And if we have, it's against the law, right? But I'm a law professor, all my students are lawyers, and they don't care about, they say, I discriminate every day, I filter people out, no problem. I know how to do this, we do the exams and everything. And these are nice people. These are not sort of the evil empire. These are people who are taught to manage, to keep people who might be vulnerable in the long term, be it musculoskeletal problems, mental health problems, other kinds of disabilities. This is what is the new normal. So how do you break the new normal? And what I saw was in this conversation was that the quota system makes it normal to hire people with disabilities and to be a proud manager saying, we love hiring people with disabilities because we have these incentives and it gives us good deals. I deplore that we live in a society that always requires a business case to do anything. And my first choice would be no business case requirements for being decent human beings. But I'm not sure we can regulate that. And if we don't have that, I'm not saying that a quota system is the way to go, but I am saying, and there's a new study that came out in Quebec last year by an economics doctoral student, the category of people who are the most discriminated against. She sent in CVs, and in one she said, my name is Mohammed, and the other one she said, my name is Jean-Guy. And then she sent in exactly the identical CVs. I'm in a wheelchair or no mention. And the category was that there was the most object of discrimination with the people with disabilities. So we've got to do something about it. And I don't say that the quota system is the correct one, but in the society we live in, I don't know what we're going to do.
I might comment before we have the rest of the panel that I myself was very involved in Ontario in the 90s when we did quite a detailed study and even sent people over to look at these systems as part of our employment equity strategy, which disappeared under another government. And there's a lot of rich experience in those systems, and people in the room shouldn't just be feeling it's just a quota and narrowly looking at that. There's a lot of supportive structures, and it goes all the way back, I think, to the First World War when people came back from the war. So many were terribly injured. So there's a sense of social obligation to it that went very deep. We were very impressed with that. So I'll just stop on that. Maybe comments on the quota system from anybody, and we'll do that. But also, another really important comment was made by this person from the Ontario government, which is the role of government in leadership and the need for improved federal-provincial collaboration. And I remember we've heard about that a lot in the roundtables, and really especially like Michael to talk to that one in a minute. So let's start with Stephen.
Thank you for pointing. Yeah. I'm like my dog, you know. You point at me and I bark.
You did put your hand up.
I just wanted to comment on the quota system because there was a lot of discussion about quotas during the negotiations around the CRPD. Because there are a lot of countries where they have very active quota systems around employment particularly. And when we were drafting the article or provision around employment, a lot of countries argued for the inclusion of some kind of discussion around quota system in the convention. And what I remember mostly from that is that there were a number of countries and a number of particularly organizations of people with disabilities from these countries where quota systems were in place, and they talked about the fact that where quotas do exist, very often corporations that are impacted by these kinds of quotas choose instead to pay the fines that are levied around not meeting the quotas rather than actually meeting the quotas. So there's a lot of back and forth discussion about that. And if you look at the text of the convention, there is no discussion about quotas in there. And I think that's very much a part of the reason why. So I'm not sure that's a particularly helpful intervention, but I do remember it. And I think it's important to keep in mind as we talk about quotas. Thanks.
Okay, let's have any comment perhaps from Michael and Emile on that. And we're, I think, running out of time. These have been sort of complex questions with complex responses. We'll probably have Michael wrap up after that.
I don't really know the quota system very well. I've heard of it, like Catherine mentions, that I've not studied it either. My gut instinct that there's not any one holy grail, that it's not going to get you what you want from one program or one type of incentive. That's going to have to be a package of things, and hopefully if you have the right checks and balances and monitor and evaluate on an ongoing basis, you always have to realize that every kind of incentive may have perverse side effects, and we just have to be very cognizant of them and be conscious to mitigate them wherever possible. And ultimately, hopefully, it'll result in culture changes. Really, the main thing is that we just need to change our attitudes, that we realize that everybody has a right to be involved in society and in work and other aspects of society, and that employers play an important role. And once we realize that it's not so complicated in many cases to make more inclusive labor market environments, that these incentives will maybe be obsolete at a certain point, hopefully, because people realize that there's lots of talent out there to tap into, and we don't need to discriminate on insignificant things such as needing special circumstances, as we all do, to make work for us.
How about we have Michael roll this issue into his wrap-up?
No, I think we've had a rich morning. I've been at a lot of disability and work, disability employment conferences over the years, and I can't remember a panel where I heard employers share so many positive, inspiring kinds of messages. So that gives me some hope of movement and direction. We need to build on that to share conversations. I'm reminded that the employers are from different sectors, and it's how to scale across sectors and up as well in the country. I liked how, when we talk about the vision or goals, Emile said, you know, our goal is to make Canada an international leader in disability and work or labor force opportunities. And until recently, there's been a sense by many people, I think, in the disability movement that we have slipped. We saw erosion over the last generation. That the image that we thought we had in the 1980s, I'm going back even further, but in the 1980s and maybe into the 1990s, around the work of the Disabled Peoples International that Steve has been connected with, and others, and with the Charter of Rights and the Court Challenge Program, and some of the other initiatives that came out of the Obstacles Report, some of you might recall in the 1980s, that we slipped. And we not only slipped, but we had governments deliberately cutting back into the achievements, dismantling the legacies. And I like to think that we see some opportunities now. I was in Toronto yesterday where the Prime Minister spoke about the national housing strategy. And a question he was asked by a somewhat skeptical person in the audience was, Mr. Prime Minister, I hear you referring to housing as a right. What does that mean for you? And I was stunned by the answer. He sounded like a housing activist from a social movement organization. And I'd like to think that even half of what he said he believes and can implement. There's a shift there in culture. And he explained it by saying we need a rights-based approach to not only housing, but he says he sees that when you start to call it a right, it folds it in to other programming areas. It folds it into education. It folds it into employment. It folds it into income and jobs. Housing is not just a sector over here or an industry. And so if we start to use a human rights-based approach, I tell you, I had to keep pinching myself. I've lived in BC where we've had a liberal government of a certain persuasion for different kind of liberals, but different kind of cuts. But again, it's just words, but it's part of that culture shift, I think. It's saying that there are expectations. We are signatories to international documents where we have said collectively as a people or peoples, we're committed to an adequate and decent standard of living. We're committed to the right to housing and access to education and so forth. And I know sometimes this kind of talk makes some people nervous in different sectors of society, using the words, never mind the word quota, but even the words rights or human rights gets some people nervous. But we need to continue to have those conversations around vision. Emile tantalizingly mentioned population health as a framework. Again, in 12 minutes, couldn't unpack that, but that's another promising framework or reference point to think about a lot of public policy, including disability and work, as to what the social determinants are of health and well-being and wellness, mental and physical wellness. You join that with Steve's comments about the UN Convention and those inspiring words in the preamble and in the first article. It's a rich document, the UN Convention. And I'm not sure what the status is, Steve, of where we're moving on the optional protocol, but the commitment we heard last year or so, that the Government of Canada was working with the provinces on getting the optional protocol adopted in our country. That would add a whole other set of processes that Steve kind of talked about his case study of the Geneva experience. And so one of my observations is that in the next day or so, and after we leave this place, there are, as Steve said, there's a number of different processes and events and occasions, whether it's the UN Convention and the reporting cycle that Canada is now committed to, whether it's federal or provincial elections. I understand there'll be one in Ontario next June. So there's these opportunities for these sorts of dialogue. Policy reviews or program evaluations or occasions for these sort of conversations. Or when governments roll out new strategies. We have British Columbia is the last province without a poverty reduction strategy. We have a government now committed to introducing a poverty reduction strategy. Some, in my opinion, across the country are far more robust than others. Some really just exist on paper. But in BC, we're going to follow, I think, the lead of Quebec and Ontario and a few others, and look at legislation around timelines, objectives, measures, and a very fulsome engagement process for poverty activists, disability groups, women's groups, Indigenous communities, and others in that strategy. So those are, again, our occasions. We need to look strategically at where these opportunities present themselves in our own communities, our own provinces, and nationally and internationally. I guess just the last comment I would make, which is to think about the full array of policy tools that we can use whenever we think about any public issue or social issue. So we've heard a bit about today about legislation or not, and then the regulations behind that, questions of quotas or standards. As I say, we've got Ontario, Manitoba, and Nova Scotia, and soon the Government of Canada will introduce an accessibility law, and with that will come a whole cycle, as people in Ontario will know, because they've had the most experience with these standards development committees and sector by sector approach to looking at how to introduce new standards of inclusion and accessibility. And again, you know, Ontario wasn't the first jurisdiction in the world to set a 20-year time frame, to say from 2005 to 2025, we hope to have an inclusive, accessible province by 2025. That's, to me at least, an honest admission that this is going to take a long time. We need to do it systematically and in a sustained, progressive way. But besides that, there's grants. Question of subsidies came up. I think we had an employer who gave a very good case for wage subsidies. There are studies that show that where targeted for particular client groups, wage subsidies could be a very effective and robust strategy. We haven't heard much about tax credits or tax measures as a way of providing incentives or penalties, but that's another toolkit. And affirmative action and employment equity. I mean, if we want to talk about quotas or targets, that's the closest we've got nationally in Canada. It's enshrined in the Charter of Rights, Section 15(2), is that we're allowed to pursue equity at the same time we pursue equality. In fact, the road to equality is often through the pathway of equity and fairness. And so, whether you call it quotas or standards, let's not forget the values and the objectives that we're trying to pursue here in terms of greater opportunity and fairness. And just lastly is the role of public services or public sectors as model employers. Again, an old idea that sort of fell out of fashion in the age of, I think Gary talked about downsizing and outsourcing and flattening organizations. That we need to, we're at a different age now. In my own province, again, the government of my province lost a Supreme Court of Canada decision over illegally breaking contracts with teachers in the year 2005. Took 12 years to work that out through the courts. Government lost, they appealed it. They lost, they appealed it. Finally went to the Supreme Court of Canada and resolved it that they had done it illegally in 2005. The government of BC is now rehiring 3,500 teachers and teachers' aides to make up for a lost generation of support. So now we're scrambling. I mean, this is not the way to do change either. But it shows when a public service and a government is not a model employer, and when it knowingly breaks laws nationally and internationally. So we need to use the convention. I think we need to use the new national legislation. They are not the only tool, but they are an important tool in advancing change. But continuing to have the conversations in events like this are important for that cultural change. Thank you. Enjoy your lunch.